The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Kate Middleton stood at the tall windows of the private sitting room, her fingers tracing patterns on the cool glass. Outside, the ancient oak trees swayed gently in the autumn breeze, their golden leaves dancing like confetti against the crisp blue sky. But Kate's mind wasn't on the beauty of the landscape before her. Her thoughts were consumed by the weight of the decision that had been made just hours earlier in the palace's most secure meeting room. William entered quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet that had adorned this room for generations. His usually confident stride seemed heavier today, burdened by responsibilities that went far beyond what any ordinary husband and father should bear. He approached Kate slowly, as if crossing an invisible threshold that would change everything between them forever. "The final papers came through this morning," William said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Kate didn't turn around immediately. She knew that once she faced him, once she looked into those familiar blue eyes that had captivated her since their university days at St. Andrews, the reality of their situation would become undeniable. The decision hadn't been made lightly. For months, the royal family had been grappling with unprecedented challenges that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy. Political pressures, constitutional crises, and personal scandals had created a perfect storm that demanded extraordinary measures. The palace advisors, government ministers, and even the Archbishop of Canterbury had all weighed in on what needed to be done. Kate finally turned to face her husband, seeing the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. They had barely slept in weeks, their private conversations filled with hushed discussions about duty, sacrifice, and the greater good. Their children had noticed the tension, asking innocent questions that neither parent could fully answer without revealing the magnitude of what was unfolding behind the palace walls. "How long do we have?" Kate asked, though she already knew the answer. The timeline had been discussed repeatedly in those sterile meetings where their personal lives became matters of state policy. Every detail had been scrutinized, every possible consequence analyzed by teams of advisors whose job it was to think 3 steps ahead of any crisis. 3 weeks, William replied, moving to stand beside her at the window. 3 weeks to prepare, to arrange everything, to say goodbye to the life we've known. His voice caught slightly on the last words, betraying the emotion he had been struggling to keep contained since this whole ordeal began. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had spent their entire marriage in the public eye, their every move documented and analyzed by media outlets around the world. Yet now, as they faced the most significant decision of their lives, they had to maintain absolute secrecy. The implications of what they were about to do could send shockwaves through the Commonwealth, affect international relations, and fundamentally alter the course of British history. Kate reached for William's hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become second nature over their years together. His wedding ring, a simple band of Welsh gold that had once belonged to the Queen Mother, felt cool against her palm. Soon, everything familiar and precious about their current life would become a memory. "The children don't know yet," Kate said, stating what they both understood to be one of their most pressing concerns. George, Charlotte, and Louis had grown up knowing they were different from other children, understanding that their father would one day be king, but they couldn't comprehend the full weight of recent events. How do you explain to young children that sometimes doing what's right means giving up everything you hold dear? William nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on a spot in the distance where the morning mist was beginning to lift from the ancient grounds. "We'll tell them together, tonight after dinner. I think they deserve to understand as much as we can safely tell them." The burden of parenthood had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, knowing that their decision would reshape their children's futures in ways they were only beginning to understand. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted their quiet conversation. A gentle knock on the door was followed by the entry of Sarah, Kate's longtime personal secretary, whose discretion and loyalty had been invaluable during these turbulent weeks. Her usually composed demeanor showed subtle signs of strain, reflecting the stress that had permeated every level of the royal household staff. "Your Royal Highnesses," Sarah said with a slight curtsy, "the Prime Minister's office has confirmed the meeting for this afternoon. The Archbishop will also be joining, as will Lord Chamberlain and the private secretary." Each name on the list represented another layer of complexity in what was already an impossibly difficult situation. Kate and William exchanged a meaningful glance. This afternoon's meeting would be crucial, the final gathering where all the details would be confirmed and the point of no return would be crossed. After today, there would be no changing their minds, no alternative path forward that wouldn't result in even greater consequences for the institution they had dedicated their lives to serving. "Thank you, Sarah," William replied formally, though his tone carried a warmth that spoke to the personal relationships that had developed with staff members over the years. "Please ensure that security is aware of the sensitivity of today's discussions, and remind everyone present about the confidentiality agreements." As Sarah departed to carry out her instructions, Kate moved away from the window and sank into one of the room's comfortable armchairs. The weight of the morning's reality was beginning to settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She thought about the thousands of public engagements she had attended, the charities she had championed, the causes close to her heart that would have to find new advocates. "Do you remember our wedding day?" Kate asked suddenly, her voice taking on a wistful quality that made William's chest tighten with emotion. "Standing in Westminster Abbey, making those vows in front of 2 billion people, promising to be there for each other through everything life might bring us." William moved to the chair beside hers, leaning forward so he could take both of her hands in his. "I remember thinking that whatever challenges we faced, we'd face them together. I still believe that, Kate. What we're doing together, and that makes all the difference." The weight of their wedding vows had taken on new meaning in recent weeks. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, they had lived through all of these circumstances during their years of marriage. But neither of them could have anticipated that for richer or poorer might literally mean choosing poverty and obscurity over the wealth and status that came with their royal positions. Kate's mind drifted to the early days of their relationship, when they were just university students navigating young love without the constant pressure of public scrutiny. Those carefree years at St. Andrews felt like a lifetime ago, yet the connection they had forged during that time remained the foundation of everything they had built together since. "I keep thinking about what our lives might have been like if we had met under different circumstances," Kate admitted. "If you had been William Wales, the history student, instead of Prince William, second in line to the throne, would we have been happier? Would we have had more freedom to make choices based purely on what we wanted rather than what duty demanded?" William considered her question carefully. It wasn't the first time they had wondered about alternative paths their lives might have taken. "I think we would have found each other regardless," he said finally. "Some connections transcend circumstances. But you're right to wonder about the freedom. We've spent so much of our marriage balancing what we wanted with what was expected of us." The conversation was interrupted by another knock on the door, this time announcing the arrival of their security detail with an update on the afternoon's arrangements. The reality of their situation was never far away, always intruding on their private moments with reminders of the complex logistics involved in every aspect of their lives. As the security briefing concluded, and they were once again alone, Kate stood and walked to a small desk where several framed photographs displayed memories from happier times. There was their engagement photo, both of them glowing with the excitement of newly announced love. Pictures from their children's christenings, family vacations, and official tours around the world told the story of a life lived in service to others while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for their family. "Whatever happens next," Kate said, picking up a photo of the 5 of them taken during their last private family holiday, "I want the children to remember that everything we did was motivated by love. Love for them, love for each other, and love for something bigger than ourselves." William joined her at the desk, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they both studied the photograph. In that image, captured just months earlier, they looked like any other family enjoying time together. The children were laughing, sand still clinging to their clothes from a day at the beach, their faces free from any understanding of the weight their parents carried. "They'll understand someday," William said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "When they're older, when they can see the bigger picture, they'll understand that sometimes love requires sacrifice. Sometimes protecting what matters most means giving up what you want most." The clock on the mantel chimed 11 times, marking another hour closer to the afternoon meeting that would set everything in motion. Kate leaned back against William's chest, drawing strength from his presence as they prepared to face whatever came next together. The afternoon sun filtered through the heavy curtains of the oak room as Kate adjusted her pearls for the 3rd time, a nervous habit she had developed during particularly stressful official engagements. The meeting that would determine their family's future was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes, and the gravity of the situation seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. William paced near the mahogany table where thick folders of documents had been carefully arranged by the palace staff. Each file contained legal opinions, constitutional precedents, and detailed plans that had been months in the making. The complexity of what they were attempting had required the consultation of historians, legal scholars, and constitutional experts from across the Commonwealth. The Prime Minister arrived 10 minutes ago, William announced, checking his watch against the grandfather clock that had kept time in this room for over 2 centuries. Lord Chamberlain is reviewing the final protocols with the Archbishop in the blue drawing room. Each person expected to attend this meeting brought their own perspective on the unprecedented situation, and managing their various concerns had become a delicate diplomatic exercise in itself. Kate nodded, smoothing her navy dress as she mentally prepared for what would likely be the most challenging conversation of their royal careers. The decision they were about to formalize would affect not just their immediate family, but potentially millions of people across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms who looked to the monarchy for stability and continuity. The events leading to this moment had unfolded with frightening speed. What had begun as whispered concerns in government corridors had escalated into a full constitutional crisis that threatened to undermine centuries of tradition. Political pressures from multiple directions, combined with personal attacks that had crossed every conceivable line of decency, had created an impossible situation that demanded extraordinary action. A soft knock interrupted Kate's thoughts as the door opened to admit Private Secretary Sir Clive Alderton, whose usually unflappable demeanor showed subtle signs of strain. Behind him followed the Prime Minister, whose grave expression immediately confirmed the seriousness of the situation they were all gathered to address. "Your Royal Highnesses," the Prime Minister said with a respectful nod, "I wish we were meeting under different circumstances. The situation has continued to evolve since our last discussion, and I'm afraid the pressure from certain quarters has only intensified." William gestured toward the seating arrangement that had been carefully planned to facilitate the difficult conversation ahead. "Please, Prime Minister, make yourself comfortable. I believe we all understand the urgency of reaching a final decision today." His tone carried the weight of someone who had spent sleepless nights considering every possible alternative to the path they were now pursuing. The Archbishop of Canterbury entered next, his presence adding a spiritual dimension to what was already a complex political and personal decision. The Church's role in matters of royal succession and constitutional change made his participation essential, but Kate could see the genuine anguish in his eyes as he contemplated the implications of what they were discussing. "Your Graces," the Archbishop said softly, using the formal address that seemed particularly poignant given the circumstances. "I have spent considerable time in prayer and consultation regarding this matter. The theological and moral implications are profound, but I understand the impossibility of your current position." Lord Chamberlain arrived last, carrying additional documents that represented the culmination of weeks of careful planning and legal research. His role in managing the practical aspects of royal protocol meant that he had been working tirelessly to ensure that whatever decision was made could be implemented with the dignity and respect that such a momentous occasion demanded. "The precedent research has been completed," Lord Chamberlain announced, placing the thick folder on the table with a gravity that spoke to its contents. "While the situation is unique in modern times, there are historical examples that provide guidance for the procedures we would need to follow. The legal framework exists, though its implementation would require careful coordination with multiple government departments." Kate felt William's hand find hers under the table, a small gesture of support that helped steady her nerves as the meeting officially began. The next few hours would determine not just their personal future, but the future of the monarchy itself during one of the most challenging periods in its long history. "Before we proceed with the formal discussions," William said, his voice carrying the authority that came with his position while also conveying the personal cost of what they were contemplating, "I want to ensure that everyone present understands the full scope of what we're considering. This isn't a decision we've reached lightly, and it isn't one that we can easily reverse once the process begins." The Prime Minister leaned forward in his chair, his expression grave as he prepared to address the political realities that had forced this impossible choice. "Your Royal Highness, the government's position remains clear. We cannot guarantee your family's safety or privacy under the current circumstances. The threats have become specific and credible, and the constitutional challenges have reached a point where normal protocols are insufficient." Kate's mind raced back to the events of the previous month, when what had begun as typical media scrutiny had escalated into something far more sinister. Death threats against their children, coordinated harassment campaigns, and deliberate attempts to destabilize the monarchy had created a perfect storm of danger and constitutional crisis that demanded unprecedented action. The intelligence reports make for sobering reading, the private secretary added, consulting one of the classified folders before him. The security services have identified credible threats from multiple sources, including foreign actors who see this as an opportunity to weaken British institutions. Protecting the family under normal circumstances has become increasingly difficult. The Archbishop spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that his comments might be recorded and analyzed for generations to come. From a spiritual perspective, the preservation of life and family must take precedence over institutional considerations. While the Church values continuity and tradition, we cannot ask any family to sacrifice their safety or well-being for the sake of protocol. William stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the familiar grounds that had been his childhood playground and would soon become a memory. "The children are what matter most," he said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room despite its subdued tone. "George, Charlotte, and Louis didn't choose this life, and they shouldn't be forced to pay the price for decisions made by previous generations or political forces beyond their control." Kate watched her husband's shoulders tense as he continued to stare out the window, knowing that he was seeing not just the immediate landscape, but the weight of history that surrounded them. Every king and queen who had walked these halls had faced moments of impossible choice, but few had confronted a situation that required abandoning everything they had been trained to protect. "The legal mechanisms are in place," Lord Chamberlain confirmed, opening one of the folders to reveal pages of carefully drafted documents. "The abdication process, while rarely used, has established precedents. The succession would proceed according to constitutional law, and arrangements for your family's transition to private life have been thoroughly planned." The word abdication hung in the air like a physical presence, carrying with it echoes of 1936 and King Edward VIII's decision to choose love over duty. But this situation was different, more complex, involving not just personal desires but genuine threats to family safety and national security that made continuing in their current roles not just difficult, but potentially dangerous. "What about the Commonwealth realms?" Kate asked, voicing one of the concerns that had kept her awake for weeks. "How will this decision affect our relationships with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the other nations that recognize the British monarch as their head of state?" The Prime Minister consulted his own briefing notes before responding. "We've had preliminary discussions with the Governor-Generals and Prime Ministers of the major Commonwealth realms. While they're disappointed, they understand the exceptional circumstances. The transition would be managed carefully to minimize disruption to existing relationships and agreements." William returned to his seat, his face showing the strain of someone who had spent months wrestling with impossible choices. "I keep coming back to the question of duty," he said, addressing the room but seeming to speak primarily to himself. "We were raised to believe that duty to the crown supersedes personal desires. But what happens when fulfilling that duty puts our children at risk?" The Archbishop leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Your Royal Highness, duty takes many forms. Your first duty is to your family, to the children God has entrusted to your care. Sometimes protecting them requires making choices that others might not understand, but that doesn't make those choices wrong." Kate felt tears threatening to spill over as the reality of their situation crystallized. Everything they had worked for, every cause they had championed, every relationship they had built through years of public service would have to be left behind. The charities that depended on their patronage, the military units that proudly bore their names, the communities they had visited and supported, all of it would need to find new champions. "The timing is actually advantageous in some respects," the private secretary noted, consulting a detailed timeline that had been prepared for this meeting. "The Christmas season provides natural cover for a period of reduced public engagements. We can begin the transition process without immediately raising public suspicion." William nodded slowly, understanding the strategic thinking behind the timing even as he recognized that Christmas would forever be marked by sadness for their family. Their children's memories of this holiday season would be shaped by goodbyes and uncertainty rather than the joy and celebration they had every right to expect. "The financial arrangements have been finalized," Lord Chamberlain announced, referring to another set of documents that detailed the complex process of separating their personal assets from Crown property. "Your private investments and inherited properties will remain yours, of course. The Duchy of Cornwall holdings will transfer according to established protocols. The discussion of money felt almost trivial given the magnitude of everything else they were giving up, but Kate understood the practical necessity of ensuring their family's financial security. They would be starting over in many ways, building new lives without the institutional support system that had surrounded them since their marriage. As the meeting continued into the evening hours, each detail that was confirmed felt like another step away from the life they had known and toward an uncertain future that none of them could fully envision. But with each decision made and each protocol established, Kate also felt a growing sense of peace about the path they had chosen. "When do we tell the children?" she asked as the formal business of the meeting began to conclude. "Tonight," William replied without hesitation. "They deserve to hear it from us before anyone else. And we need time to help them process what's happening before the announcement becomes public." The weight of that conversation loomed ahead of them, representing perhaps the most difficult parenting moment they would ever face. The dinner dishes had been cleared away, and the family was gathered in the cozy sitting room of their private apartment at Kensington Palace. George sat cross-legged on the carpet with a book about airplanes, while Charlotte carefully arranged her collection of model horses on the coffee table. Louis played quietly with building blocks, creating elaborate towers that he would knock down with gleeful laughter before starting again. Kate watched her children, memorizing these ordinary moments that would soon become precious memories. The normalcy of the scene, homework scattered on side tables, William's reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed some papers, the gentle ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. All of it would change dramatically in the coming weeks. "Children," William said softly, setting aside his documents and removing his glasses. "Mummy and I need to talk to you about something very important. Could you all come sit with us, please?" George looked up from his book, his young face immediately showing concern at the serious tone in his father's voice. At 10 years old, he had developed an intuitive understanding of adult moods and could sense when conversations carried unusual weight. Charlotte abandoned her horses and climbed onto the sofa next to Kate, while Louis toddled over to William with his favorite teddy bear clutched against his chest. Kate felt her heart breaking as she looked at their innocent faces, knowing that what they were about to share would fundamentally change their children's understanding of their world. These three beautiful souls had been born into extraordinary circumstances, but they had also been sheltered from the worst aspects of public life through careful planning and fierce protection by their parents. "Is something wrong with Granny?" Charlotte asked, her 8-year-old mind immediately jumping to the most obvious concern. The Queen's recent health issues had been a source of family worry, though the children had been shielded from the full extent of the situation. "No, darling," William replied gently, lifting Louis onto his lap while gesturing for George to join them on the sofa. "Granny is doing well. This is about our family, about some changes that are going to happen in the coming weeks." George settled next to his father, his mature expression showing that he was prepared to listen carefully to whatever serious news was about to be shared. As the eldest, he had always felt a special responsibility toward his younger siblings, and Kate could see him mentally preparing to be strong for Charlotte and Louis. "You know how Daddy has a very special job," Kate began, choosing her words carefully to make the complex situation understandable for young minds. "Being a prince means helping people and serving our country, but it also means that our family is different from other families in some ways." Charlotte nodded solemnly, her hand finding Kate's as she sensed the gravity of the conversation. "Like how we have security people and can't go to the shops by ourselves?" she asked, referencing one of the many ways their lives differed from those of their school friends. "Exactly like that," William confirmed, his voice gentle but steady. "Well, sometimes being different in those ways can become difficult, even dangerous. And when that happens, parents have to make very hard decisions to keep their families safe." Louis, too young to fully grasp the implications of the conversation, played contentedly with his father's tie while the older children absorbed this information. Kate was grateful for his innocence, knowing that the upheaval ahead would be confusing enough for him without the added burden of understanding all the reasons behind it. "Are we in danger?" George asked directly, his question cutting straight to the heart of the matter with the clarity that children often possess. His eyes moved between his parents, searching for reassurance while also showing a maturity that reminded Kate of William at the same age. William and Kate exchanged a brief glance, having discussed how much detail to share about the security concerns. They had decided that honesty, appropriately filtered for young minds, would be better than vague explanations that might lead to more anxiety and confusion. There are some people who want to hurt our family because of Daddy's position, Kate explained carefully. Not because of anything we've done wrong, but because some people think that by hurting us, they can hurt the country or change things they don't like about how things work. Charlotte's grip on Kate's hand tightened, her young face showing a combination of fear and confusion that broke her mother's heart. But we have bodyguards, she said, as if the security measures that had always surrounded them should be sufficient protection against any threat. We do have wonderful people who work very hard to keep us safe, William acknowledged, shifting Louis to make room for Charlotte to snuggle closer to him. But sometimes, even with all their efforts, the safest thing for a family to do is to step away from the situation that's causing the danger. George, whose sharp intelligence had always impressed his teachers and tutors, seemed to understand the implications before his parents could fully explain them. You mean we're going to stop being royal? He asked quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and something that might have been relief. Kate felt tears threatening to spill over at her son's perceptive question. Yes, sweetheart, she said softly. Daddy is going to give up his position as a prince, which means we'll become a private family instead of a royal one. The silence that followed this announcement was filled with the children's processing of information that would reshape their entire understanding of their identity and future. Charlotte was the first to speak, her practical nature asserting itself as she worked through the implications. Does this mean we won't live in the palace anymore? She asked, looking around the room that had been home for her entire life. The familiar surroundings, the paintings chosen by their parents, the comfortable furniture that had witnessed countless family moments, the toys and books that marked this as a space belonging to children, suddenly seemed to take on a bittersweet quality. We'll be moving to a new house, William confirmed, his voice remaining steady despite the emotion Kate could see in his eyes. A house where we can have more privacy and where you can grow up without worrying about photographers or people wanting to know everything about your daily lives. Louis looked up at his father with the trusting expression of a 4-year-old who believes his parents can solve any problem. Will my toys come with us? He asked, his priorities clearly focused on the tangible things that mattered most to his young world. All of your toys will come with us, Kate assured him, smoothing his hair with gentle strokes. Everything that belongs to you will come to our new home. We'll still be the same family, just living differently. George had been quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the magnitude of what he had been told. When he finally spoke, his question revealed an understanding of their situation that surprised both parents. Will I still be a prince when I grow up? He asked. Or will I be able to choose what I want to be? The question struck at the heart of one of the most painful aspects of their decision. By removing their children from the line of succession, William and Kate were giving them something that had been denied to generations of royals, the freedom to determine their own futures without the weight of predestined roles and responsibilities. You'll be able to choose whatever you want to be, William replied, his voice thick with emotion. You could be a pilot like you've talked about, or a scientist, or a teacher, or anything else that interests you. Your life will be your own to decide. Charlotte seemed to brighten at this news, her adventurous spirit already beginning to imagine possibilities that had never been available to her before. Could I be a veterinarian? She asked excitedly. And work with horses and dogs without worrying about whether it's a proper job for a princess? You could be the best veterinarian in the world if that's what you wanted, Kate replied, smiling through her tears at her daughter's enthusiasm. You could go to university wherever you wanted to study, live wherever you wanted to live, and marry whoever you wanted to marry, all without anyone else having opinions about whether your choices were appropriate. The conversation continued for another hour, with the children asking practical questions about their new life, while their parents tried to balance honesty with age-appropriate explanations. They talked about the new schools the children would attend, the friends they would be able to make without security clearances, and the simple pleasures of anonymity that most families took for granted. As the evening grew later and Louis began to yawn, William carried him to bed while the older children helped Kate tidy up the sitting room. The ordinary domestic routine felt precious in its normalcy, a reminder that beneath all the protocol and public duty, they were simply a family who loved each other. Mummy, George said as he gathered his books, are you sad about not being a princess anymore? Kate paused in folding Charlotte's school uniform, considering how to answer a question that touched the core of her own complex feelings about their decision. I'm sad about some things, she replied honestly. I'll miss the charities I work with and the people I've met through royal duties. But I'm not sad about having more time with you and your siblings, or about being able to make choices based on what's best for our family instead of what's expected of us." Charlotte, who had been unusually quiet while thinking through everything they had discussed, suddenly looked up with a serious expression. "Will people hate us for leaving?" she asked, her concern revealing a mature understanding of the public's investment in their family's royal role. "Some people might be disappointed," William replied, having returned from settling Louis in his bedroom. "But most people will understand that sometimes families have to make difficult choices to stay safe and happy. The people who really care about us will support whatever decision we make." As they prepared for bed that night, Kate reflected on how well the children had handled the news. Their resilience and adaptability reminded her that young people often cope with change better than adults, especially when they feel secure in their parents' love and protection. The hardest part was still ahead of them. In the morning, they would begin the process of saying goodbye to the life they had known, starting with the staff members who had become like extended family over the years. Each farewell would be another step toward their new reality, another reminder of everything they were choosing to leave behind in order to secure their family's future. But tonight, as Kate listened to William read bedtime stories in the next room and heard their children's sleepy laughter, she felt a peace that had been absent for months. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family united by love rather than divided by the impossible pressures of public duty. The following morning brought with it a flurry of activity as palace staff began implementing the carefully orchestrated plan that would transition the family from their royal roles to private citizenship. Kate stood in her dressing room, looking at the formal gowns and tiaras that had been such an integral part of her public life, knowing that most of these magnificent pieces would remain behind as part of the crown's collection. Sarah entered quietly, carrying a list of appointments and farewells that would fill the next 2 weeks. "Your Royal Highness," she said, her voice betraying the emotion she was working hard to control. "The first round of personal meetings begins this afternoon. The senior household staff have requested a private audience with you and His Royal Highness." Kate nodded, understanding that saying goodbye to the people who had supported their family through countless public and private moments would be one of the most difficult aspects of their departure. These weren't just employees. They were individuals who had dedicated years of their lives to serving the royal family with discretion, loyalty, and genuine care. William appeared in the doorway, already dressed for what would be his final official engagement as a working member of the royal family. He was scheduled to visit a veterans support center that afternoon, a bittersweet appointment since military charities had been one of his greatest passions throughout his royal career. "The children are having breakfast with their protection officers," William reported, his voice carrying a note of sadness. "They're explaining how security will work differently in our new life. Apparently, George has been asking very detailed questions about whether they'll still need to check under cars for bombs." Kate felt her heart clench at the reminder that their children had grown up with security concerns as a normal part of daily life. The thought of Louis, barely old enough to understand why strangers always surrounded them, learning that these protective measures might no longer be necessary was both relieving and unsettling. "Lady Susan sent a personal note," Sarah continued, referring to one of the Queen's longest-serving ladies-in-waiting. "She wanted you to know that Her Majesty understands completely and sends her love. The Queen asked me to tell you that family must always come first, and that she's proud of the courage you're both showing." The Queen's support meant more to Kate than almost any other blessing they could have received. As a woman who had dedicated her entire life to duty and service, Her Majesty's understanding of their impossible situation validated their decision in a way that helped ease some of the guilt they both carried about abandoning their responsibilities. "What about the charities?" Kate asked, referring to the organizations that had come to depend on her patronage and advocacy. This was one of the aspects of their departure that caused her the most personal anguish, knowing that her absence would affect real programs helping real people. "We've arranged transition meetings with each of your patronages," Sarah replied, consulting her notes. "Several members of the royal family have already volunteered to take on additional charitable responsibilities to ensure continuity of support. The Princess Royal has been particularly generous in offering to expand her portfolio." William joined them, carrying a stack of briefing papers for his final engagements. "I spoke with my father this morning," he said quietly. "He's struggling with the political implications, but he understands our position as parents. He asked me to tell you that he considers you the daughter he never had, and that nothing will change his love for this family." Kate felt tears welling up at the king's message. The royal family's support during this crisis had been unwavering, even as they grappled with the institutional challenges that their departure would create. The monarchy would adapt and continue, but the personal relationships that had developed over years of shared experiences would be more difficult to maintain once they stepped away from royal life. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and a young page entered to announce that the first group of staff members had assembled in the blue drawing room for their farewell meeting. Kate and William exchanged a meaningful glance, knowing that this would be the beginning of a series of emotionally charged conversations. The blue drawing room had been arranged with comfortable seating in a circle, creating an atmosphere more suited to an intimate family gathering than a formal royal audience. The senior staff members who had gathered represented decades of combined service to the royal household, and their faces showed a mixture of sadness, understanding, and concern for the family they had served with such dedication. Mrs. Patricia Williams, the head housekeeper who had overseen every aspect of their domestic arrangements for the past 8 years, stood as they entered. Her eyes were already bright with unshed tears, and Kate immediately moved to embrace her warmly, protocol abandoned in favor of genuine human connection. "Your Royal Highness," Mrs. Williams said, her voice shaking slightly, "we want you to know that every single member of the household staff supports your decision completely. We've watched you struggle with this situation for months, and we've seen how it's affected the children. You're doing what any good parents would do." William shook hands with each staff member individually, taking time to acknowledge their specific contributions to the family's well-being over the years. These were the people who had arranged birthday parties, managed Christmas celebrations, coordinated family vacations, and handled countless small crises that never made it into the public eye. "We need you all to understand," Kate said as they settled into their seats, "that this decision has nothing to do with our satisfaction with your service or our affection for any of you personally. You've become family to us, and leaving you behind is one of the hardest parts of what we're doing." James Morrison, the head of security who had protected their family through numerous threats and challenges, leaned forward in his chair. "Ma'am, if I may speak freely, the current threat environment has become unmanageable through conventional means. The decision you're making is strategically sound from a security perspective, even though it's personally devastating for all of us." The conversation continued for over an hour as they discussed practical arrangements for the transition period and shared memories from their years of working together. Stories emerged of behind-the-scenes moments that had never been made public. The time Louis had gotten lost in the palace corridors and was found by a footman playing hide and seek with the corgis, Charlotte's elaborate plans for redecorating her bedroom that had required diplomatic negotiations with the housekeeping staff, George's serious discussions with the gardeners about establishing a vegetable patch for the family. "What happens to all of you?" William asked, addressing a concern that had been weighing on both him and Kate. "We want to ensure that our departure doesn't negatively affect anyone's employment or career prospects." "The palace has been very generous," Mrs. Williams replied. "Everyone will be reassigned within the royal household system, and several of us have been offered positions with other members of the family. The transition has been planned carefully to ensure minimal disruption to our careers." Sarah stood and moved to a side table where she had arranged several wrapped packages. "The family has prepared some personal gifts," she announced, "tokens of appreciation that we hope you'll accept as reminders of the years we've shared together." Kate and William spent time with each staff member individually, presenting personalized gifts and sharing specific memories that highlighted each person's unique contribution to their family's happiness. For Mrs. Williams, there was a leather-bound photo album documenting family celebrations she had helped coordinate. For James Morrison, a custom watch engraved with coordinates marking locations where he had kept the family safe during overseas tours. "There's something else," Kate said as the formal gift-giving concluded. "William, and I want you all to know that you'll always be welcome in our new home, whatever and wherever that may be. The relationships we've built here don't end just because our official roles are changing." The final hour of their gathering was spent sharing contact information and making plans for future communication. The staff members had become genuinely attached to the family, particularly the children, and the thought of losing regular contact with George, Charlotte, and Louis was clearly difficult for many of them to accept. "Will you tell the children something for us?" asked Mary Sean, the assistant private secretary who had often helped coordinate the children's schedules and activities. "Tell them that watching them grow up has been one of the greatest privileges of our careers. They're remarkable young people, and They're going to do amazing things with the freedom you're giving them. As the meeting concluded and staff members began to file out, each stopping for final embraces and whispered words of encouragement, Kate felt overwhelmed by the depth of loyalty and affection these people had shown their family. In a world where royal service was often portrayed as cold and formal, the reality had been warm human relationships built on mutual respect and genuine care. "They'll be fine," William said quietly as they watched the last staff member leave. "They're professionals who understand that circumstances change and institutions adapt. But it's going to be strange not having them as part of our daily lives." Kate nodded, wiping away tears that had been threatening to spill over throughout the entire meeting. "I keep thinking about all the people we won't get to say goodbye to individually," she said. "The charities we support, the military units, the communities we've visited. How do you say farewell to an entire life's work?" "One conversation at a time," William replied, putting his arm around her shoulders. "And by trusting that the work will continue without us. The causes we care about will find new champions, and the institutions we've served will adapt and grow stronger." That afternoon's official engagement proceeded with the poignant awareness that it would be William's final public appearance as a working royal. The veterans he met with seemed to sense the significance of the occasion, and several privately expressed their support for his decision to prioritize his family's safety over public duty. As evening approached, and they returned to Kensington Palace, Kate felt the weight of how much their lives had already begun to change. Tomorrow would bring more farewells, more conversations, more steps toward a future that remained largely unknown but felt increasingly like the right choice for their family's well-being and happiness. 3 weeks had passed since their decision was made, and the day of their final departure had arrived with a mixture of crisp December air and emotional weight that seemed to settle over Kensington Palace like a gentle snowfall. Kate stood in the nursery that had been Louis's domain since his birth, watching as the last of his belongings were carefully packed away by removal staff who worked with the reverent efficiency of people who understood they were handling history. The public announcement had been made 48 hours earlier, delivered simultaneously through official palace statements, and a deeply personal video message that William and Kate had recorded together. The response had been overwhelming in its complexity: shock, sadness, understanding, criticism, and an outpouring of support that had surprised them with its intensity and reach. "The last box from George's room is ready," William announced softly from the doorway, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent days saying goodbye to a life that had defined his existence since birth. Behind him, the sounds of careful packing continued as professional staff worked to separate their personal belongings from the crown property that would remain behind. Kate turned from the window where she had been watching early morning joggers in Hyde Park, people living ordinary lives that would soon mirror her family's new reality. "How are the children handling it?" she asked, though she could see the answer in William's expression. The excitement of adventure had given way to the reality of leaving behind everything familiar. "Charlotte cried when she realized she couldn't take the climbing frame from the garden," William replied, settling into the rocking chair where Kate had spent countless hours feeding and comforting their youngest child. "But then she brightened up when I reminded her that our new house will have its own garden where she can help choose everything that goes into it." The new house, a substantial but private property in the Cotswolds, represented a complete departure from palace life while still providing the space and security their family needed. It had been purchased quietly through intermediaries months earlier, renovated discreetly, and prepared to become home to a family that was about to disappear from public life as completely as modern circumstances would allow. George appeared in the doorway, looking unusually serious for a 10-year-old, but carrying himself with a maturity that reminded Kate of William at the same age. "Mom, the car is here for Louis's last session with his speech therapist. Should I help him get ready?" Kate smiled at her eldest son's protective instincts toward his younger siblings, a trait that had become more pronounced during the upheaval of recent weeks. "Thank you, sweetheart. Could you also check that Charlotte has her favorite books packed in her personal bag?" She was worried about not having them during the journey. As George headed off to complete his assignments, Kate reflected on how differently each child was processing their dramatic change of circumstances. George seemed to understand the gravity of what was happening while also showing excitement about the freedom their new life would provide. Charlotte alternated between sadness about leaving familiar places and enthusiasm for new adventures. Louis, at 4 years old, was mostly excited about the concept of moving to a house with horses nearby. "The Prime Minister called this morning," William said, checking his phone for what must have been the 20th time that day. "The transition arrangements are proceeding smoothly, and King Charles has formally accepted the abdication documents. It's official now. We're officially commoners as of noon today." The word commoners carried no negative connotation in their conversation. Instead, it represented liberation from constraints that had governed every aspect of their lives for years. Common meant ordinary, private, free to make choices based on personal preference rather than public expectation or constitutional requirement. A gentle knock interrupted their conversation as Sarah entered with a final briefing folder and an expression that mixed professional efficiency with personal emotion. Over the past 3 weeks, she had managed the impossible task of dismantling a royal household while maintaining absolute discretion about the family's future plans. "Your Royal High," Sarah began, then caught herself with a small smile. "Kate and William, the last of the official correspondence has been handled. All patronages have been formally transferred, military appointments have been reassigned, and charitable commitments have been transitioned to other family members. The palace has prepared a final statement thanking you for your years of service." Kate felt a complex mixture of relief and melancholy at hearing their names spoken without royal titles for the first time in over a decade. The absence of formal address would take getting used to, but it also represented the beginning of their new identity as a private family with the freedom to define themselves without reference to inherited titles or constitutional roles. "What about security?" William asked, addressing one of the few aspects of their transition that would continue in modified form. While they would no longer require the extensive protection necessary for senior royals, the threats that had precipitated their departure meant some ongoing precautions would be necessary. "The arrangements are in place," Sarah confirmed. "Discreet, private security that will allow you to live normally while maintaining appropriate safeguards. The team understands that their job is to protect your privacy as much as your safety." Charlotte burst into the room with the energy of a child who had been containing emotions all morning and could no longer keep them inside. "Mummy, Mrs. Morrison from the kitchen made special biscuits for our journey, and she wrote us a letter that she says we can't read until we get to the new house." Kate knelt down to embrace her daughter, thinking about all the small kindnesses that had marked their final weeks at the palace. The staff had found countless ways to show their affection and support, from special meals to carefully preserved mementos that would help the children remember their time in royal residences with fondness rather than sadness. "Are you ready for our adventure?" Kate asked Charlotte, smoothing her daughter's hair with gentle strokes that had become automatic over 8 years of motherhood. "I think so," Charlotte replied with the honesty that children bring to complex emotions. "I'm sad about leaving, but I'm excited about having friends over without security checks and being able to go to the cinema like a normal family." William stood and moved to the window, looking out at the grounds one final time before they left forever. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said quietly. "All the normal experiences we'll get to have now. Teaching the children to drive in our own driveway instead of a secured facility. Walking to the local shops on Saturday morning. Having neighbors who know us as William and Kate instead of their royal highnesses." The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor signaled that their departure time was drawing near. Louis appeared with his backpack and favorite stuffed animal, followed by George carrying a careful stack of books he had chosen to accompany them on the journey to their new life. "Is everyone ready?" asked Detective Inspector Sarah Johnson, who would be accompanying them for the final time as their royal protection officer. After today, a smaller, private security team would take over responsibility for their family's safety. Kate took one last look around the room that had witnessed so many precious family moments, then nodded firmly. "We're ready," she said, surprised by how true those words felt despite all the uncertainty that lay ahead. The drive to their new home took place in comfortable family vehicles rather than official royal cars, another small symbol of their changed circumstances. As they passed through the palace gates for the final time, Kate felt William reach for her hand, squeezing gently in a gesture of solidarity that had sustained them through months of impossible decisions. "Look," Charlotte said excitedly, pointing out the window as London's familiar landmarks gave way to countryside scenery. "Everything looks different when you're not in a royal car." George laughed at his sister's observation, and even Louis clapped his hands as they passed a field of sheep that seemed to notice their convoy with mild interest. The children's resilience and adaptability continued to amaze Kate, reminding her that young people often handled major life changes better than the adults who worried about protecting them from upheaval. "What do you think we'll do first when we get to the new house?" William asked, engaging the children in conversation that focused on possibilities rather than what they were leaving behind. "I want to see my new room and arrange all my books," George replied immediately. "I want to meet the horses," Charlotte added, referring to the stables on their new property that had been one of the selling points when they chose the house. "I want to play in the garden," Lewis announced, his priorities remaining beautifully simple despite all the complexity surrounding their family's transition. As the countryside rolled past their windows and the children chattered excitedly about their new life, Kate felt a sense of peace settling over her that had been absent for months. They had given up titles, positions, and public roles, but they had gained something infinitely more valuable: the freedom to be simply a family whose primary obligation was to each other's happiness and well-being. The final leg of their journey took them through a small village where ordinary people were going about their Saturday afternoon activities: shopping, walking dogs, tending gardens, without any awareness that a family who had once been at the center of national attention was quietly joining their community. "There it is," William said softly as their new house came into view. A beautiful stone property surrounded by gardens and fields that would provide the privacy and space their family needed to heal and grow. "Home." Kate squeezed his hand as they pulled into the driveway, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family united by love rather than divided by the impossible weight of public duty. The farewell to their royal life was complete, and their new beginning was about to unfold with all the promise and uncertainty that came with choosing love over tradition, family over institution, and hope over fear. As they stepped out of the cars and the children ran toward their new front door, Kate felt the last weight of royal protocol lift from her shoulders. They were no longer their royal highnesses. They were simply Kate and William, parents who had chosen to give their children the most precious gift possible: the freedom to write their own stories.